The day my daughter-in-law slid the folder across the kitchen table toward me, I was still on a walker. 63 years old, 3 weeks out of the rehab facility, and my left leg still felt like it belonged to someone else. I had my coffee. I had the morning news on low. And then she sat down across from me with that look, the one I'd seen on her face at the hospital, at the discharge meeting, at every family dinner for the past 2 years, like she was doing me a favor by being in the same room. "Martin wants you to read this," she said. "Martin is my son." I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. "What is it?" She pushed it a little closer. "Just read it, Gene. My name is Eugene. My late wife Barbara, called me Gene. My son called me Dad until sometime around his 30th birthday, when he apparently decided that made him sound young. I hadn't heard Dad from him in close to 4 years. I picked up the folder. It was a quitclaim deed for my house. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the before. I worked for 31 years as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm out of Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't rich, but I was careful. Barbara and I bought our house in 1987, a 4-bedroom colonial on just under half an acre in Westerville. We paid it off in 2009. When she got sick, I used some of our savings for her care, but I was smart about it. I had a financial advisor. I had a will. I had a plan. Barbara passed in March of 2021, pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend a lot of time on that part because it still sits in my chest like a stone, and I don't think it belongs here. What belongs here is what happened after. Martin is our only child. He married a woman named Tiffany in 2016. She's not a bad person exactly. She's just precise about money, about space, about what belongs to whom. At the reception, she made a joke about the inheritance laws in Ohio, and I thought it was a joke. I still thought it was a joke 2 years later when she started asking me about the plan for the house. "I just think it's a lot of property for one person," she said once over Thanksgiving. At your age. I was 61 at the time. After Barbara died, Martin started calling more, coming around more, helping with things around the yard, which I appreciated genuinely. I was grieving. I was alone for the first time in 34 years. When your son shows up and trims the hedges, you don't analyze the motive. You make him a sandwich, and you're grateful. In the fall of 2022, they invited me to move into their guest room temporarily, while some work was being done on the house. I should have questioned what work exactly. The house didn't need work, but I was still foggy from grief. And being in that house alone in the winter felt like standing in a room where all the furniture had been removed. I said yes. I was there for 6 months. During those 6 months, I noticed things. Tiffany had a home office where she did something. She had an LLC, Martin told me vaguely. Real estate, maybe. Or consulting. He was fuzzy on the details whenever I asked, which I found odd because Martin had always been the kind of man who liked to explain things. He'd been that way since he was a boy, but he stopped explaining things to me somewhere around the time he married her. I went back to my house in March of 2023. Spring helped. I got into a routine. I had a neighbor across the street, a retired postal worker named Clifford, who came over on Sunday mornings, and we'd watch the pre-game shows together. I had my church. I had a Thursday poker group at the community center. I wasn't thriving exactly, but I was upright. Then in September I fell. I was on a ladder, which I know, 62-year-old man on a ladder cleaning gutters, but I'd been doing it for 30 years, and I didn't see the reason to stop. The ladder shifted on wet leaves I hadn't seen. I came down hard on my left side on the driveway, broke my femur, cracked 2 ribs, hit the back of my head enough to spend 2 nights in the ICU before they moved me to a regular room, then a rehab facility for 3 weeks. Martin came to the hospital. Tiffany came once, briefly, and sat in the corner of the room looking at her phone. Martin was attentive in the way that felt just slightly off, like a man who wants to seem like a good son rather than a man who simply is one. He asked a lot of questions about the recovery timeline. He asked about my insurance twice. He asked whether I'd thought about the house, whether the stairs were really appropriate for my recovery. I told him I'd been managing those stairs for 36 years. He smiled in that tight way he'd developed. "I just worry, Dad." It was the first time he'd called me Dad in I don't know how long. I noticed it. I told myself not to read into it. I was wrong to tell myself that. I came home from rehab the second week of November. Martin picked me up. Tiffany was at the house when we arrived, which surprised me. She had a key I'd given Martin years ago for emergencies. She'd made a pot of soup. She was warm, almost aggressively warm in a way that reminded me of a salesperson who has already done the math on whether you can afford what they're selling. We ate. We talked. It was pleasant enough. And then she got up to clear the dishes and Martin said, "So, Dad, there's actually something we wanted to run by you." I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment. I felt the thing that's hard to name. A kind of alertness that isn't quite fear but is in the same family. Something in the air pressure of the room changed. He nodded at Tiffany. She sat back down and put the folder on the table. That's when she said it. "Martin wants you to read this." I opened the folder. I read the first page twice. A quitclaim deed transferring the property, my property, the house I'd bought before Martin was out of high school, into an LLC. The LLC's name was something like Westerville Property Holdings. I didn't recognize it. "What is this?" I asked. Martin leaned forward. He had the look he gets when he's rehearsed something. "It's a property management structure, for tax purposes. Tiffany's been talking to a financial planner, and apparently if we hold it under an LLC, you save on estate taxes when I die," I said. "That's not, I mean eventually, yes. It's just planning, Dad." Tiffany said, "It protects you, actually. If you ever had a liability issue, a slip and fall on the property, someone could sue you personally. This way, the asset is protected." I looked at the deed again. It transferred ownership to the LLC. My name was nowhere in the LLC documents in the folder. "Who owns this LLC?" I asked. Martin glanced at Tiffany. "It's a family structure. We'd all be." "Who owns it?" Tiffany said carefully. "Right now, in terms of the formal structure, Martin is the managing member, but it's a family asset. It's my asset," I said. "It's my house. I bought it in 1987. It's paid off. My wife and I paid off that mortgage. My name is on that deed, and no one else's." The room went quiet in a specific way. Martin said, "Dad, we're not trying to take anything. This is about protecting what you have." I put the folder down on the table. I picked up my coffee cup. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because my heart was doing something irregular. "I need you to leave," I said. "Dad, I need both of you to leave my house right now, and I need my key back. I want to tell you that I called a lawyer the next morning because I was sharp and clear-headed and had immediately understood the full picture. That's not exactly true. What's true is that I sat in my kitchen until almost midnight, going through things I half remembered from the past year and a half, and seeing them differently. The questions about the house, the 6 months I'd spent in their guest room while work was being done, and I'd never seen a contractor not once, the questions about my insurance at the hospital, Martin asking about the recovery timeline like he was calculating something, Tiffany's LLC. I called a friend from church in the morning, a woman named Harriet who'd been through a difficult estate dispute with her own family after her husband died. She gave me the name of an attorney. I called him that afternoon. His name was Stephen Valls, and his office was in Worthington, and he was exactly the right person for what I was facing. We met 2 days later. I brought everything I had, the deed, the folder they'd left, my will, the title, insurance documents. The first thing he told me was that I had done nothing wrong. The deed was unsigned. I hadn't been tricked into transferring anything. Whatever they had hoped would happen at that kitchen table, it hadn't. The second thing he told me made my stomach go cold. "Have you checked your homeowner's insurance recently?" he asked. I said I had automatic renewal. I hadn't looked at the actual policy documents in about a year. He told me to go home and look. I did. The primary policyholder had been changed. It had been changed 8 months earlier, while I was staying with them, when Martin had offered to take care of the renewal paperwork because I was grieving and exhausted, and he was, I thought, being helpful. The policy was still active. I was still listed. But Martin had been added as a co-owner with rights to modify the policy and receive claim communications. More than that, there was a rider I didn't recognize added at the same time that designated a beneficiary for a payout in the event the property was transferred or sold. That beneficiary was Tiffany's LLC. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I read that. I thought about Barbara. I thought about the two of us standing in this kitchen in 1987, 30 years old and terrified and proud, the first people in either of our families to own property. I thought about the mortgage payments we made during the years when money was genuinely tight, when Martin was in middle school and we were driving used cars and bringing lunch from home. I thought about paying off that mortgage and how we'd gone out to dinner to celebrate, just the two of us, and she'd cried a little, and I'd pretended not to notice because I knew she'd want me to. I thought about how she would feel knowing this had happened inside the house she loved, at the kitchen table she'd picked out at a furniture store in 1994. I called Stephen Voss the next morning and told him what I'd found. Here's what I want to be clear about, because I've told this to a few people and they always ask. I don't know exactly what they intended. I don't know if they planned for me to fall off that ladder. I don't know if the timing was opportunistic, me injured, me dependent, me in their guest room signing renewal paperwork without reading it, or if there was something more deliberate underneath it. I have my suspicions. Stephen Voss had his suspicions. We were careful about what we could prove versus what we believed. What we could prove was enough. Stephen sent a formal letter to Martin and Tiffany in December, 14 months ago now. It outlined the unauthorized modification of the insurance policy, the undisclosed LLC, and the circumstances of the quitclaim deed presentation. It made clear that I had retained legal counsel and that I was requesting, formally and in writing, that Martin be removed from the insurance policy, that the rider be canceled, and that the original deed status be confirmed and documented. He also noted, in language that was precise without being inflammatory, that the insurance modifications may have constituted fraud under Ohio law, and that we were reserving the right to pursue any applicable remedies. I did not hear from Martin directly for 11 days. When he called, he didn't sound like my son. He sounded like a man who had talked to a lawyer of his own. He said he was sorry for any confusion. He said Tiffany had handled the paperwork and he hadn't fully understood what the writer meant. He said they'd both made mistakes, and he hoped we could move forward. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Then I said, I need you to sign the removal authorization Stephen sent you. All of it, within the week. He did. He signed it all within 5 days. This past spring, I redid my will entirely. I'd had one since 2008, but it needed updating after Barbara passed, and honestly, it needed rethinking. I worked with Stephen on it for 2 months. Everything is documented, witnessed, properly notarized. The house is in a trust now, a revocable living trust with me as the trustee, which gives me complete control while I'm living and clear direction for what happens after. The trust has a successor trustee who is not my son. I also put a note in the file, not a legal document, just a letter in my own handwriting explaining what happened. What I found, what was attempted, what I did about it. Stephen said it wasn't necessary legally. I told him it was necessary to me. I still live in this house. I had the gutters cleaned by a service this fall. I still watch the pregame with Clifford on Sunday mornings, though now we do it at his place half the time, because his wife makes biscuits that I have no defense against. My leg is mostly healed. I walk with a slight stiffness in cold weather, but I haven't needed the walker since February. Martin called in August. We talked for about 20 minutes. It was civil. I don't know what it was beyond that. He's my son, and I love him in the way that doesn't stop even when you want it to. A little, just for a while. But I don't trust him the way I once did, and I've had to make peace with the fact that some things, once you've seen them clearly, you can't choose to unsee. Tiffany and I have not spoken. There's something I go back to sometimes, a quiet thought I keep coming back to in the early mornings when the house is still, and I'm on my second cup, and the light is just starting to come through the back windows. They thought I was diminished. They thought the grief and the injury and the age and the loneliness had made me someone who could be managed. Someone who would sign something because his son brought him soup and his daughter-in-law used a warm voice. They thought they knew what my signature meant. They were wrong about that, and I made sure they understood exactly how wrong. This house was Barbara's home. It was our home. And for whatever years I have left, it is going to stay exactly that. I keep thinking about the soup. Tiffany made a pot of soup the day Martin brought me home from rehab. It was warm. The house smelled like something welcoming, and I sat at my own kitchen table and ate it and felt for just a moment like maybe the loneliness of the past 2 years was going to ease up a little. That's the part that stays with me, not the anger. The soup. How ordinary it was. How much I wanted to mean what it looked like. I don't think what Martin and Tiffany did came from nowhere. That's not me making excuses for them. It's me being honest about how these things actually work. They didn't sit down one afternoon and decide to become people who would take a grieving old man's house. It happened the way most slow-moving wrongs happen. One small compromise at a time, one rationalization building on the last, until what started as, we should think about Dad's estate planning, became a quitclaim deed, and an LLC with my son's name on it, and my name nowhere to be found. The cause was always going to produce that effect. That's not fate. That's just arithmetic. What I learned about myself through all of this is harder to say cleanly. I had always thought of myself as a careful man. 31 years as an engineer, I checked my work. I understood load-bearing structures the way a building either holds or it doesn't, the way there's no negotiating with physics. But I had let grief make me careless about the structures in my own life. I stopped reading the paperwork. I stopped asking follow-up questions. I handed Martin a key and trusted that love was a sufficient safeguard. It isn't, always. Love is not the same thing as integrity. I know that, now in a way I didn't before. The morning after I found the insurance rider, before I called Stephen, I sat with it for a while. I could have panicked. I could have called Martin and screamed at him and made it a fight that burned everything down. Instead, I made a second cup of coffee, and I thought it through. I asked myself what I actually knew versus what I suspected. I asked myself what I wanted the outcome to be. I decided I wanted the house and I wanted the truth documented, and I wanted to handle it in a way Barbara would have recognized as me. Steady, thorough, not cruel but not soft either. That clarity didn't come from being smart. It came from making myself slow down when every instinct was telling me to react. There's something I'd want anyone in a similar situation to understand. Being older, being alone, being in recovery from an injury, none of those things make you less capable of protecting yourself. They can make you feel that way. And the people who want to take advantage of that feeling are counting on you to believe it. My son and daughter-in-law looked at a 63-year-old man on a walker and saw someone who could be managed. What they miscalculated was that the same stubbornness that got me up those rehab steps every morning was going to get me to a lawyer's office too. I signed nothing that day at the kitchen table. I asked them to leave. I got my key back. And then I did the slow, undramatic, necessary work of making sure it could never happen again. The updated will. The trust. The letter in the file in my own handwriting. The house is still mine. That's the whole story, really. Barbara and I built something together. And I held on to it, not out of spite, not out of stubbornness alone, but because some things are worth the fight, and knowing which things those are, that's not something anyone can take from you unless you let them.